I stood in the dimly lit kitchen, my hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing the endless pile of dishes that never seemed to shrink. My back ached, my fingers wrinkled from the hot water, but I kept going, lost in the rhythmic motion of washing and rinsing. The sound of a chair scraping against the dining room floor pulled me out of my trance. "Alara, bring me some tea. Now!" I closed my eyes for a second, exhaling slowly through my nose before turning my head toward the source of the voice. Alex sat at the dining table, his phone in one hand, barely glancing up at me. His tone was sharp, impatient, as if he were talking to a servant instead of his wife. "Hold on, I'm doing the dishes." "What?" he scoffed, incredulous. "Stop that and bring me the tea right away. Can't you obey simple commands?" Before I could respond, another voice joined in, one that never failed to make my skin crawl. "Make me some sweet coffee," Mrs. Whitmore called out from the living room. She was seated comfortably on the couch, a slice of cake in her hand, her lips curling into a smirk. I sighed, glancing at the half-clean dishes. "There are so many. Leave them for later," she cut me off. "Just do what we say." "Useless wife," Alex muttered, shaking his head. The words stung, even though I should have been used to them by now. For years, this had been my life, serving a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenience, an extension of his household, catering to a mother-in-law who had never accepted me, who had made it her mission to belittle me at every turn. I had married Alex when I was 23, full of hope and love, dreaming of a partnership built on mutual respect. But the reality was far from what I had envisioned. We lived in Alex's parents' house, a decision made under the pretense of supporting his widowed mother after his father's passing. In the beginning, I had sympathized with her grief, thinking maybe her sharp words were a result of pain. But years passed, and it became clear that her cruelty was not born of sorrow, but of control. At first, it was small things, criticizing my cooking, making passive-aggressive remarks about my cleaning. But soon it escalated. Nothing I did was ever enough. If I made dinner, it was either too bland or too oily. If I cleaned, she would inspect the surfaces with a white glove, searching for invisible dust just so she could sigh in disappointment. It was not just her. Alex, the man who had once whispered sweet words to me under the stars, had become a mirror image of his mother. Dismissive, demanding, cruel. I had become invisible in my own home, a ghost flitting through the halls, only noticed when something was needed from me. But that night, something inside me cracked. When I set the tea and coffee down in front of them, neither looked at me. They continued their conversation as if I didn't exist, as if my presence was as insignificant as the furniture in the room. Something inside me whispered, "This will never change." I had tolerated it for years, convincing myself that things would get better, that maybe one day Alex would wake up and remember the love we once shared, that maybe Mrs. Whitmore would soften, would see me not as a burden, but as someone who had given up everything to care for this family. But that moment, standing there with an empty tray in my hands, watching them sip their drinks without so much as a thank you, I realized the truth. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a servant, and I was done being one. I walked away without a word, heading to the bedroom where my son was already fast asleep. He was the only light in my life, the only thing that kept me anchored through the years of neglect and cruelty. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching his small chest rise and fall with each breath. I had stayed for him, but now I knew. I needed to leave for him. The next morning I woke up early. I went about my usual routine, preparing breakfast, getting my son ready for daycare, cleaning up the house before work. But today I did something different. I opened my laptop and typed in the words that would change my life. How to file for divorce. As I scrolled through the options, reading about the process, about child custody, about financial separation, a strange sensation settled in my chest. It was fear, but it was also relief. For the first time in years, I was allowing myself to think of a future where I wasn't trapped in this house, in this cycle of humiliation and exhaustion. For the first time in years, I was thinking about myself, but before I could go any further, a voice shattered the silence. "Alara, where's my blue shirt?" Alex's voice carried through the hallway, impatient as ever. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. Soon he wouldn't be my problem anymore. I didn't answer him right away. I let him call for me again. Louder this time, his irritation creeping into his voice. "Alara," I said, "where is my blue shirt?" I stood up from my desk, moving slowly, as if savoring the moment. I walked to the bedroom where he stood in front of the closet, his arms crossed. "You mean the one I washed, ironed, and hung up 3 days ago?" He frowned, glancing around, and finally spotted it. He pulled it from the hanger without a word. "Thanks," he muttered, already turning away. I stared at his back, feeling the anger bubble beneath my skin. A thank you, it had been months, maybe years, since I'd last heard one from him, but it wasn't gratitude. It was reflex, meaningless. He didn't appreciate me. He just expected me to be there. But not for long. That afternoon, while he was at work and Mrs. Whitmore was out visiting one of her friends, I gathered my documents, my bank statements, and my savings. I met with a lawyer, a woman who radiated confidence and understanding. "You've been the sole provider for the household?" she asked, flipping through my paperwork. "Yes." "And your husband? Does he work?" "He used to. He quit when his father died and never went back. He always said he'd find something, but it's been years." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "And your mother-in-law?" I let out a humorless laugh. "She doesn't work. She doesn't do anything, actually." The lawyer nodded. "Well, you're in a strong position, Alara. You have financial independence, proof of neglect, and even emotional mistreatment. We can file for full custody of your son and ensure they don't get a cent more than they deserve." I exhaled, a weight lifting from my chest. "When do we start?" Filing the divorce was just the first step. I didn't tell Alex right away. I wanted everything in place first. I wanted to make sure that when I walked away, there would be no turning back, no manipulation, no last-minute guilt traps. But something changed in the house. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the way I stopped flinching at their words, the way I no longer rushed to obey their demands. Maybe it was the way I looked at them, like they were strangers. Or maybe it was the fact that I had finally stopped caring. Mrs. Whitmore noticed first. "What's wrong with you?" she snapped one evening as I set down dinner. "You're quiet. Brooding. Are you sick?" "No," I said calmly. "Just tired." "Well, you should rest," she said with false sweetness, "after you clean the kitchen." Normally I would have nodded, resigned. But this time I looked her straight in the eye and said, "No." She blinked. "Excuse me?" I said no. "Clean it yourself." Her face turned red. "How dare you speak to me that way?" I met her glare without flinching. "I dare because I'm done." Alex, who had been scrolling through his phone, finally looked up. "Done with what?" "With this. With you. With this house." I reached into my bag, pulled out the divorce papers, and slapped them onto the table in front of him. His face went pale. "What the hell is this?" "Exactly what it looks like. I'm leaving. I want full custody of our son, and I won't be paying for this house anymore." Silence, then a laugh. A cruel, mocking laugh from Mrs. Whitmore. "You're bluffing," she sneered. "You can't leave. You need us." I tilted my head. "Need you? For what? To cook? Clean? Work while you both sit around doing nothing?" Alex finally found his voice. "This is ridiculous. Where are you going to go? How are you going to afford it?" I smirked. "I've been the one affording everything for years, Alex. I'll be just fine." His expression shifted, something like fear creeping into his eyes. "We can talk about this," he said quickly. "Let's not make any rash decisions." "I already have." I turned to my son, who had been watching from the doorway, his little face full of uncertainty. I knelt down, brushing his curls from his forehead. "We're leaving, sweetheart. We're going to have our own home. Just you and me." His eyes lit up. "Really? Really?" He threw his arms around my neck, and for the first time in years I felt whole. Behind me, Alex was still talking, still trying to salvage what little power he thought he had left. But it was too late. I was already free. Alex and his mother didn't take the loss well. I expected anger, denial, maybe even threats. But what surprised me the most was the sheer desperation. "You can't do this, Alara." Mrs. Whitmore's voice cracked as she watched me pack the last of my son's belongings. Gone was the arrogance, the entitlement. Now she just looked lost. I already did. She reached for my arm, her grip weaker than I expected. "Who's going to take care of us?" I almost laughed at the absurdity. That was never my job. She opened her mouth to argue, but I turned away. I had nothing left to say. Alex stood by the doorway, watching silently. His usual smugness was gone, replaced by something else. Something that almost looked like regret. "Laura," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Do you really hate me that much?" I sighed, shaking my head. "I don't hate you, Alex. That's the saddest part. I just don't love you anymore." His face fell, and for a brief second, I thought he might cry. But instead, he clenched his jaw, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Fine. Go. But don't expect to come crawling back when you realize you can't handle it." I smiled. "You still don't get it, do you?" And with that, I left. As I drove away, my son chattering excitedly in the back seat about our new home, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Alex and his mother would struggle. They would try to calm me, try to manipulate their way back into my life. Maybe one day Alex would realize what he had lost. Maybe Mrs. Whitmore would understand that she had driven away the one person willing to put up with her cruelty. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they would just keep blaming me, keep resenting me, keep waiting for me to come back. But I wouldn't, because for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself. And that was the most satisfying revenge of all. To anyone reading this who feels trapped, who feels like they are giving everything and receiving nothing in return, know that you deserve better. You are not a servant. You are not a punching bag. You are not an afterthought. You are enough. And you owe it to yourself to walk away from anyone who makes you feel otherwise. What do you think? Would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have done something different? Let me know in the comments.